This is definitely the most complicated lesson so far. So in this lesson, I will show you how to build a database. So what is a database? Well, a database is exactly as the name implies. It is a complex file containing an array of tabular information, a base of data. Typically, this information is arranged in a kind of spreadsheet fashion containing a myriad of fields. Now, sometimes these tables of information will cross-reference other tables, and consequently, databases can become very sophisticated. Now, there are many different types of databases, and they use many different names. Microsoft uses SQL, pronounced SQL databases. MySQL, which is MySQL, is a database used most often with PHP. So for this lesson, I will build a simple MySQL database which displays information from a single table. I will also build an administrative interface which allows you to edit, delete, and enter information into the database. So some computer nerds call this a 3-tier database because it has 3 functions: writing, editing, and deleting. Whatever. It's a database. Okay, the whole 3-tier thing is just more lofty nomenclature used by nerds to make themselves feel smarter than you. And they aren't. Okay? So before we create our web pages, we need to build the database. So how do you build a database? Well, your hosting provider should have information when you log into your hosting account to set up a database. Now, most of the PHP web hosting plans will use an interface called phpMyAdmin to create a database. So in most cases, you'll simply log into your web hosting account and find a section about creating a MySQL database. Now, remember, this database is going to be accessed using PHP, so you will need a PHP account to get this to work. And unfortunately, I can't tell you how to reach your phpMyAdmin interface because obviously every hosting provider will be different, okay? But once you get in there into the phpMyAdmin, here is what you need to do. As I said, every single host is different, but for the most part, you'll use an interface like this where you create a name and a password for your database. Once you create your database, you'll be presented with an interface like this, and you'll have to start creating tables within it. So let's do that. We'll create a table called state information with 4 columns, and we click go. And that creates our initial table. As soon as this finishes loading. There we go. And let's say we don't want 4 columns. We want 5, okay? So we can go right here, click add 1 column, and it adds 1 column. So the first thing we want to do is have an ID number that is associated with every record in the database. So that's what we're going to name our first field, is ID. And we want that to be a primary key, and we want it to auto-increment. So we select those 2 things. The next thing is, say, state name, and we're going to make that a varchar, which is a variable number of characters, and we're going to have that as a length of 255. And then we'll say, let's see, we got the ID, we got the state name. I think year founded is good for the next one. That is an integer. It's only 4 characters. And then we can do state bird. That's a varchar. We'll also put it to the limit. And then we'll do the state motto, which is a text field. And that should be it. So that is our table. And you can see we have character fields, we have number fields, we have text fields, and we have an auto-incrementing ID. So let's save that. And there we go. Now it switches us over to the Structure tab, and it shows all of our field names, tells us the type of field that is. Now if I go to browse, you'll notice it's empty, right? So I have all the fields, but there's no data in this database yet. So let's go to insert, and we'll start to enter things. So I won't enter anything on ID because I want that to increment all by itself. So we'll go with Ohio as our first state that we're going to put in here. And the motto is, with God, all things are possible. And that's it. That is our first entry into our state information database. So I click Go. Here it shows the query that inserted that data in there and showed those values. We click Go again, and then I come back into Browse, and I accidentally put it in twice because I didn't need to hit Go that second time. So, as you can see though, it's actually kind of good that I made that mistake, because you can see the two entries that the ID number did increase all by itself, right? So we can delete that second entry since we didn't really need that one. And there we go. There's our single entry in our database. So from here, you can just enter more states and you will have a populated database. Once the database is created, the first thing I can show you here is how to display the information. So here we go with a very simple web page that just writes out a table and shows the 5 records that are in the database. So let's take a look at the PHP code and see how this actually works. So here is that page when you're coding it in PHP. And actually, let's go back here for a second and view the source. And you'll see it's extremely simple. It's just a plain old table. You got your first row, which contains all of this, the ID, the state, founded, bird, and motto. And then all these table rows get repeated, and they contain all the data that we're looking for. So that's what it looks like to the browser. But when you're actually writing the code, it looks like this. So a little bit more complicated, but I can walk you through this and you'll see it's not that difficult. So the first thing you need to do is connect to the database. So that's what we're doing with this include file. And because I don't want people to actually be able to access this database and change it, I'm not going to show you all the actual connections, but this is the code for that database connection. So you would insert your host name, username, password, and database name, and then this would actually make the link. Okay, so next, this line of code, here is a variable that is pulling out everything from, as you can see up in here, this is another variable, database link. So it's saying, okay, I want this variable, all the entry results from the database link, and you're telling it to select, and here are all of the fields that are in the table state information. Now, if you want to pull out every single field, you could also use an asterisk. You could do that, okay? And that would do the same thing. But for the purposes of teaching you how to do it, I wanted to actually write down every single field name. So next, we get to the loop, okay? So that is just calling out the data. But next we come to this where it says counter equals 0, okay? So we're basically telling it, you know, start at 0 results, and each time you find an entry in the database, you write this block of code out again, okay? So here's a while loop, and here's another variable, okay, the entries, which is fetching all of this variable from up here. And then here we can see the echo, and we see the additions for the counter too, by the way. And then we see the echo for one table row, okay, which is this. It's just one table row. And we're telling it loop through and recreate this table row for every record that you find in the database. So there are 5 records, so it loops through and it recreates that table row 5 times with the corresponding data, okay? And it's really simple. You can see right here, it's the entries, and we're calling all of those fields. So we're calling ID, state name, year founded, state, bird, and motto, which of course matches up right here with the state name and the year founded and the bird and all that. And then finally, you also want to close the database. It's not something that you absolutely have to do, but it's just a good practice, because if you have too many people hitting your web page and the database connections don't close, it could potentially crash the database. So technically, you should always close your connections at the end. So that's it. This is really the most simplistic way that you could write this kind of code to display information from the database. So for the sample code, I am removing the actual database name and connections, so not just anyone can reach this database, but you'll still understand the basics of how it functions. So the next lesson will show you how to build a page that will allow you to add new entries into the database, plus how to edit or delete existing entries. Now, this type of administrative page is often called a CMS, or content management system, and this is the basis for websites like WordPress and Drupal and things like that. Now, I have been building CMS applications like these since I first started programming in 1998. The concept is pretty simple, and by elaborating on the principles, you can build blogs and interfaces so your clients will have the power to edit their own websites without knowing any code. Now, I don't want the database to be compromised by people entering bogus information, so it's not going to have actual database connections on the live website and on the connect line, but all the rest of the code that I show you, it's all going to work. All right, here we go. This is the most complicated thing that I've shown you so far, but this is really awesome because this is a basic content management system. So this is the basics of what all kinds of social media sites do. It's the basics of WordPress sites and Drupal sites and all this stuff that's very trendy and very popular. You don't need any of that because you can build it yourself, okay? That's exactly what this is. This allows you to edit records in the database, to add new records to the database, and to delete existing records. So let's start to go through this, and we'll start with, because there's a lot of stuff to get through, let's just start with a display of this page itself. Okay, so let's view the source code, and you'll see it's very similar to the previous lesson where it was showing and just displaying all of these things. But now, of course, we've added these couple rows of edit and delete, and we've added the add new record. So what are those exactly? Well, if we look at the edit row, we can see that it's just a link to a new page called edit. And then there's this new kind of thing that we haven't seen before, this question mark ID equals, okay? And then there's a number 1 on the first one. The second entry has a number 2. Third entry has a number 3, and so on, okay? And the same applies to delete, right? It goes to a new page, then it's question mark ID equals, and then there's an ID number for delete. So what does that mean? Well, this question mark ID equals 1, that is called a query string. And you may have noticed on some websites that you go to, there's this really long, complicated string of numbers and letters and things after the kind of root of the URL. Well, that's what those are. They're query strings. And query strings cause the browser to kind of access different pieces of information from a database. Okay, so let's say we come here and we want to edit the Ohio entry. So if we click edit, you'll notice there is the query string in my URL, okay, the ID equals 1. And it takes me to this form that actually has all of the data for Ohio already in there. Okay, so if I go back and I go to edit California, we can see the ID changed to a number 2, and now all the California data is in here. Okay, so in other words, I'm always hitting the same page. All right, I'm always hitting this lesson C edit PHP. On every single link, that stays the same, but what's changing is the ID number. So the data that's filling up my form here is different every single time I hit the edit button, and it corresponds to that database entry. Okay? Make sense? All right. So let's come back and look at the actual source code that's writing this page. So once again, you can see this is exactly like the code that displays the information. The only difference is that we added these couple rows right here. And the ID for the query string corresponds to the ID of the entry. Okay. Now, it doesn't have to be that. If I wanted, I could have made it the state name. I could have made it the state bird. I could have done anything as this query string identification. Okay. The only reason that I'm using number 1 is because I know that the numbers are always going to be different. Okay, if it would have supposedly, let's suppose 2 states had the same state bird, then that would mess it all up when you tried to edit the thing, right? So use something that's a unique identifier like the ID. And then of course the next thing we see is the delete link, and once again it's using the ID from that record entry. Okay, and then add new record, that just goes to a whole new page. All right, so that's kind of the basics of how this initial page is laid out right here. So let's start to look at each of these things individually, editing, deleting, and adding new records. So let's start with adding a record, because that's probably the simplest one. So if we go here and we click add new record, we'll just put in, I'll just put in a bunch of, fake stuff. What do we have for some of the others? Let's see here. What states have I already done? Okay, we've done all those. So let's put in, let's say, Iowa. All right, just for the heck of it. We'll put in Iowa. I have no idea when Iowa was founded. We'll say it was founded in 1873, which I'm certain is wrong. The bird, yeah, let's make it a parakeet. The state bird of Iowa is a parakeet. I know, if you're from Iowa, you're probably going, what are you talking about? That's not what it is. Okay, and the motto is, hey, baby, I'm from Iowa. Let's not put an apostrophe in there because that's probably going to break it. I'm not prepared to go into that much detail yet about how to set this up, but that apostrophe will probably break it. Hey, baby, I'm from Iowa. It's a parakeet 17. Okay, there we go. That's good. So now let's hit submit and see what happens. There we go. It takes us back to our edit page, and we can see Iowa has been added to the list. Now, I know the first thing you're wondering is, wait, why is that a 12? Shouldn't that be a number 6? Well, it's because during the course of working on this and building all this stuff out, I, of course, have done a lot of testing and a lot of experimenting. So I had other records in here that I deleted. Okay, so it's just going with the very next ID number that was available and that's never been used. Okay, so let's take a look now at the source code for all this stuff. So let's go back again to add new record and view the page source. Now here you can see it's really, really simple. And if we go into the actual source code here, we can see it's exactly the same, right? There's actually no PHP on this page at all. It's just a simple form. There's inputs for each of those fields, okay? And a submit button, all stuff that we've seen before and used before. We have a post under our method and under action. It's telling, okay, we're going to go to this processing add page. And that's where all the fancy footwork starts to happen. So if we go into here, processing add, now we can see it's nothing but PHP, okay? So the first thing we have to do is connect to the database, and then it's telling it, okay, we're going to insert into the state information table all of these fields. So you'll notice that that's everything except for the ID number, right? So all we're inserting is those 4 lines: state name, year founded, state bird, and motto, okay? But we're not inserting the ID because the ID gets added automatically by the database. So these are the names in this table, okay? These are the values, you can see from the next line here. These are the values that are coming from the form, okay? Now, all of these names correspond to one another just so that it's easy to understand, okay? But remember, all these things are variables, so it doesn't have to be this. Like I could, for example, in this form, I could call this something completely different. I could call it, you know, Fu Manchu, and then in the processing page, I would change that to Fu Manchu, but it would still correspond to state name in the database. Okay, does that make sense? So this stuff doesn't have to be the same. It just has to correspond one by one in the order that the stuff is being entered into the database. Okay, so let's switch that back. And that's pretty much it right here. That's the line that inserts the data into the database. And then this next part here, this is basically saying, okay, once it inserts all of that information, then redirect back to the editing page. So that's why right after I made the entry, it took me right back to this page instantly. And then it says if there's an error of some sort, it'll display the error instead. Okay, but there wasn't an error, so it just worked and it redirected me. And then here, of course, we close the database connection. So that's it. Pretty simple. It's not too sophisticated to do an add, but that's really how it's done. The add page, like I said, no PHP. Just the processing page has this little bit of PHP on it to add a new record into the database, and then it shows up. Next, let's talk about how to edit one of the entries. Okay, so let's come to the edit page, and again, we see the form with all of this data already filled out. And then let's say we'll change this from, hey baby, I am from Iowa. You betcha. I am from Iowa, you betcha. All right, now, when I hit submit, it takes us back to that record was edited successfully, okay? That's just an extra page I put in. I know the last time it took us right back to the display page, but I wanted to show you something that was a little bit different. You could also go to a whole new page. And here if we go to return to administration, there we go. The you betcha has now been added in. Okay, so we successfully edited that record. So let's take a look at the source code for this stuff. So when we go to the edit page, this right here represents the edit page, which is this. And if we view the page source, we can see that there are values, all the stuff that's actually showing up on the page, the Iowa and the 1873 and all that, they're showing up in the value field. Even the you betcha, hey baby, is all in there under the motto, okay? And you'll notice that I also have a hidden field, and remember the hidden fields don't actually show up on the page. You can't see them here, but they're hidden in the code. There is an ID associated with it, which is number 12, which is, of course, this ID number, okay? So we have all of that right here in the source code. Now, if we look here on the page, we can see that, again, a lot of this is like stuff we have seen before, but here are all the values, and the PHP echoes are writing in all of this stuff from the database, right? The corresponding fields, we got the state name and the year founded is getting the year founded information, the state bird, the motto, and then here is the ID being written to the hidden field. But here's where you'll notice things are a little bit different. So if we come back to the actual page, remember we have our query string with our ID equals 12, right? And remember that is telling the browser which record from the database to get the information from. So if we come in here, we can see we created this new variable called ID, which is the ID of the query string right there, okay? And then we're creating this new variable pulled from database. Again, it's using the database link, which we've seen before. It's using the select, which we have seen before from state info, right? We've seen all that information before. The new thing, though, is this right here at the end, where the ID equals $ID, okay? So in other words, what it's saying is pull all of this information from the database, but only where the ID number in the database matches this ID number, which corresponds to the query string, okay? That makes sense? So pretty much all the same stuff that we've done before. The only difference is we're saying only give us the information from the state information table where the ID matches that, okay? And then once again, we do the entries, and we have an array that's pulled from that, and then the entries variables are getting written down here, okay? So still pretty simple. It's not that complicated. It's again very similar to everything that we've done in the past. The only thing that's different is we're only pulling one record from the database, and that one record is being identified from the ID number of the query string in the URL. So how does the page actually get processed? Well, let's take a look at that. So once we fill out the form, you can see right here it's sending everything to this page called Processing Edit. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Again, not really complicated, but it's a little bit different from the add page that we've looked at in the past. So here we have our initial database connection, and then right here we're taking all of our entries from the form. Okay, so we've got the ID and the state name and the year founded and the motto and all that, and we're creating variables for each of those form fields. Next, this line is the one that actually updates the database. So before we had an add command, and now it's update, or no, it's insert into when you're adding a new one. But now it just says update state information, so we've got the name of the table that's being updated, and then this command set, and then once again we can see stuff that's all really easy to follow. So state name is the field name in the table, and then it's using this variable that we just created called state name. Year founded corresponds to our year founded variable, state bird and motto, and once again at the end we're saying where the ID equals the ID from the form. So now we're not using the query string to update it, now we're using this. Now we're using the hidden field from the form to do this update, okay? Because you can see right here, the post ID, that is this field right here. It's the ID field from the form on the previous page, okay? So that's how the browser knows which record in the database to update, because we still have to pass along that number of that number 12. We have to pass that along onto this processing page. And then once again, once it does that, once it does the update, it's all stuff that we've seen before. Right here, it has an if statement saying, okay, if everything goes fine, then it redirects us to this edit results page, and if anything goes wrong, it throws an error message, and finally it closes the database connection. So that's pretty much it. That's all you have to do for the edit page. That one is, of course, a lot more complicated than adding a new record, because you kind of have these two steps of, instead of having a blank form, you actually have to have data in the form, right? And then edit it from there. So editing is probably the most complicated of all three things of adding, editing, and deleting. But now you should get it. Now you should see exactly how a record is edited in a MySQL database using PHP. Finally, let's look at deleting. Deleting is definitely the easiest thing to do. So we can see here our example we've been using of record number 12 from Iowa, and we'll just hit delete. Now, again, this is going to go to a processing page, and that's pretty much it, right? Once we hit delete, now it tells you, okay, it was deleted successfully. We return to our administration page, and we can see Iowa is no longer in the list. So let's go back here and look at our processing delete page. So remember that there's no form that has to get filled out here. That's why I was saying this is probably the most simple thing, because all you're doing is sending it to this processing page. So once again, we connect to the database. Once again, we're using the query string as an ID, and then here we go. This is just delete from the state information table where the ID matches the ID of that query string. That's it. That's all you got to do. There's not much to this one. And then once again here, you can see the code that you're familiar with where it says, okay, if everything went fine, then we redirect to the results page. And if anything broke, it throws an error message, and then we close the database. So that's it. This is the only thing that's really different from all the other stuff we've done. And as you can see, it's incredibly simplistic. So deleting is definitely the easiest method of the three things. So there you go. Now you know all of this stuff, and use your imagination with what you could do with this, right? Because once you have all of this, now you can create a profile for people who come to your website, right? Where they would fill out a form. Instead of state and founded and bird and motto, it would be their name, it would be their email address, and all that kind of thing. And then they can start to keep records of all that stuff, right? And then they can come in and they can edit records, and they can add new stuff, or you could delete things. I mean, like I said in the beginning, this kind of content management system, this is the power of all social media right here, right? I mean, you can create a blog out of this, right? You can make a new record, and instead of using these little fields, you could create a great big text field where you can type in an entire paragraph of information. So there's so much stuff that you can do once you understand these really basic concepts of adding, editing, and deleting records from a database. This is really foundational stuff for very, very powerful websites. Now you understand the basics of how to build a database and how to edit that information through a website interface. Now, for most websites, it will be quicker and easier to simply use XML instead of a database. Databases are really only useful when you have a need to add, edit, and remove data, or when you need to display massive quantities of changing data. However, if you just need to show a few items on a page, using XML is far more sensible. But like I said, this is also the basis of all social media. So once you learn this, you're way ahead of any developers who are just starting out and learning how to build websites. And remember, kids, the world owes you nothing until you create things of value.